Hello, everybody. I'm Brendan Dooley, Professor of Renaissance Studies at University College Cork and Principal Investigator of the Euronews Project, which is funded by the Irish Research Council and hosted by University College Cork and the Medici Archive Project in Florence, Italy. From the first emergence of regular news reporting in the 15th century to the development of media giants in the 20th, the communication of daily matters of public concern to a wide audience has been a major feature of life in Europe and the Atlantic world. News, almost from the start, became a commodity exchanged for money or favors, sometimes connected with state administrations, sometimes not. In modern times, journalism has become one of the pillars of democracy. While the Euronews Project normally engages with the origins of news, this series on the journalist's craft extends our reflections to contemporary times, with guests actively involved in the news gathering process who will share their experiences and views. In each meeting, the Euronews staff interviews a different news or news history professional from around Europe and the Atlantic world, as we seek to define, describe, and contextualize the varieties and essence of the journalist's craft in current and past practice. With me here today is Michael Schudson, Professor of Journalism at Columbia University and an authority on the history of communications and on trends in journalism and many other related matters. Thank you so much for being with us and welcome to the journalist's craft.
Thank you very much.
All right. Now, Professor Schudson grew up in Milwaukee, studied undergrad at Swarthmore College, did his graduate work at Harvard University under Daniel Bell and others. Previous assignments before his appointment to Columbia in 2009 included the University of Chicago and the University of California at San Diego. He's a recipient of many awards, including the much coveted MacArthur Foundation grant and the Murray Edelman Distinguished Career Award from the Political Communications section of the American Political Science Association and the International Communication Association, as well as being a Guggenheim Fellow and a resident fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto. Major publications include, most recently, Journalism, Why It Matters, out last year on Polity Press, as well as Journalism, Why It Still Matters, which appeared in 2018. And also in 2018, co-edited with David E. Posen, Troubling Transparency on Columbia University Press. Then there is The Rise of the Right to Know, Politics and the Culture of Transparency, 1945 to 75 in 2015. And with C.W. Anderson and Leonard Downey, The News Media, What Everyone Needs to Know, Oxford, 2016. Other work includes The Fundamental Discovering the News, A Social History of American Newspapers, back in 1978. Advertising, The Uneasy Persuasion, 1984. Reading the News, 1986. Rethinking Popular Culture, Contemporary Perspectives in Cultural Studies, 1991, edited with Chandra Mukherjee. Watergate in American Memory, How We Remember, Forget, and Reconstruct the Past, 1992. The Power of News, 1995. The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life, 1998. Why Democracies Need an Unlovable Press, 2008. The Sociology of News, 2003, re-edited in 2011. The Enduring Book, 2009, edited with David Paul Nord and Joan Shelley Rubin in the History of the Book in America series. And on. An impressive record indeed. Over the years, he's had a key influence on the historiography of journalism, as well as on its sociology, and even on defining what journalism really is. I have to say on a personal note that when I was a young associate professor at Harvard in the 1990s, I used to sit next to Dan Bell, the Harvard sociologist, at the old library luncheons in Leverett House, where we were both part of the enlarged staff. And when I explained my current research, he said, "You've got to look at the work of Michael Schudson." And so I did. In fact, in the course of our discussions within the Euronews Project, I conveyed this suggestion to our research fellow, Davide Boerio, go read Schudson. And so he did. And from this, one thing led to another. So welcome to our series, Michael. We're so glad to have you here. And I think I could start with a question going a little back in time to the sociology of news, if you don't mind. And what I'm thinking of here is, so you say in the sociology of news that news had become a dominant force in the public construction of common experience and of a popular sense of what is real and important. Do you still believe this? And could you elaborate a little bit on this statement?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about that question and recalling a book by William Gilmore called "Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life." And that's talking about rural life in New England in the early 19th century. And the book is quite an interesting one, I think, but I particularly like the title because it suggests that reading wasn't always a necessity of life, but that, as Gilmore discusses it, a kind of infrastructure of support for reading had emerged in the course of the early 19th century in particular. Libraries, books, the availability of books through bookstores, through the mail, all these features that made it possible for reading to influence people. But it also meant that there were new uses for reading, that what was public and important to a farmer in a small Vermont village in the early 1800s extended, or at least was beginning to extend beyond the territory that he would walk to or travel by horse or carriage to in his immediate vicinity. There was the state of Vermont. There was the country, nation state of the United States. There was trade that affected his livelihood, and that had reached a new stage more in the 19th century than ever before. So, and there were newspapers, mostly weekly newspapers, but even in small towns, there were weekly newspapers. And they, in fact, from most of what I've read, didn't tell you very much about your locale. They were about national news and even more foreign news. And that was of growing relevance. Partly it was entertainment about kings and queens and wars in Europe for the rural Americans. But it was partly also that this was something that meant something to people's everyday lives as it had not before.
That's fascinating. And thinking about this situation of novelty and the actual practicality of reading, you might say the gesture of reading and what that meant reminds me of that famous quotation from Hegel, where he's talking about the reading of the newspaper having become a kind of secular daily prayer in society. So I'm thinking of two aspects of what you just said, so that on the one hand, we have the content or the information that's actually in the paper, but then there's also the question of what that reading, what that sitting down and reading might do in terms of, well, sociology.
Yes. Reading connected people. You know, it's like a cartoon of the husband and wife across the breakfast table from each other. Now where's my phone? Now we're on our phones. It used to be people had the newspaper up in front of them. I think it's probably this we could extend as a metaphor, I guess, but it both separated them and connected them. It allowed people to dwell in a world they constructed themselves through and with the newspaper, but then they would put the newspaper down and hey, Julia, look what I've just read. And that became a kind of, a cliche of modern, now just past modern life. And then it also was subject matter for when you went down to pick up your mail at the post office, or when you went to the market, or when you were standing at the bus stop later. You had the day's news as common currency.
That's so fascinating.
I just was looking again, as I do every few years, at Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Mrs. Bennet says that her occupations in life were the news and visiting. And they were connected too.
That's beautiful, and I appreciate also very much the way you distinguish these spheres. So there's a domestic context in which this reading occurs, and which may have an effect on that nucleus of the family. And then there's the larger context of the community where this reading is taking place, and so forth. But I'd like to move now in a slightly different direction. And I'm thinking now of another excerpt from your Sociology of News, where you begin a chapter with these words, and this is fantastic. It says, "Sources, they are the deep, dark secret of the power of the press. Much of this power is exercised not by news institutions themselves, but by the sources that feed them information. News, as political scientist Leon Siegel put it, is not what happens, but what someone says has happened or will happen. To understand news, we have to understand who the someones are who act as sources and how journalists deal with them. News is a product of transactions between journalists and their sources. News represents those who are the authorized knowers, and what are their authorized versions of reality." Now, based on what you know, would you like to elaborate on the relation between news and sources, and who these sources are and where they come from, and how this may have changed in recent time?
Okay. Well, and not having been a reporter myself, I haven't experienced those relationships, but it's easy enough to learn about them from reporters and from controversies about sources and from particularly controversies about anonymous sources, and also controversies eventually about very public sources. That is the criticism that journalism received, particularly beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, but some even earlier, that reporters were too dependent on their sources. That is, they were deferential to the sources, and they didn't want to lose sources by saying something unkind in their news reports about the individuals who had given them information. And journalists past for a long time, and certainly present, take great pride in their independence. So when they were criticized, in this case, more from the left than from the right, in the 60s and 70s, they were criticized for being deferential to their sources, for being too comfortable about being part of the political establishment. Well, they were and they are part of the political establishment in a sense, in that they do have intimate connections with government officials. Those are the authorized spokesmen about reality, authorized in part by democracy itself. Many of them got elected, others are appointed by those who got elected. And others lower down in the hierarchy whose names we mostly don't learn, but who provide reporters on many occasions with the story behind the story, or at least leads to the story behind the story. In the American case, Deep Throat being the most famous of them during Watergate. But we have lots of others as well. And this is a world within worlds. This is the world of, in particular, in the US, Washington, or in the UK, it would be in London, or so the places where the news gathering takes place. There's so much emphasis. I mean, as someone who's written about the history of newspapers, I always like to remind people that newspapers, even if you don't read one on paper, I still do, but even if you don't, if you get your news from television, like the largest chunk of the population does in most countries, or if you get it online, it began with a news organization that began as a newspaper. So people may get their news elsewhere, but radio, television, and digital sources get their news from newspaper organizations. That's still true.
Okay. So sources are enormously fundamental, and also can be controversial, and also the material about which news is being told, so to speak. And I wanted to draw attention to, I have to say, one of my more favorite quotes from your work, which goes like this, and this is from your article on the anarchy of events. And here's where you say, of course, news is socially constructed. In this, the scholars are correct. Journalists make news, but they do not make it up. News is socially constructed, but is constructed out of something, not out of whole cloth. Events are one of the things that prevent both states and markets from taming and controlling the news. A fundamental truth about journalism is that all journalists recognize, but almost no social scientists, things happen. not only do things happen, but as a familiar US automobile bumper sticker says, shit happens. That is what provides a supply of occurrences for journalists with which to work. Shit even happens to the rich and powerful, and it makes for a great story when it does, end quote. Now, I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on this quote. And I'm thinking also in terms of well, this is provocative, I suppose, but what is, after all, an event? And can news change the way we experience events? I guess that's what I was trying to ask.
Yes. What is an event? Yeah, I do think it's still true, although journalism has become, I think, vastly more ambitious than just reporting events. But events is still the center of what journalists report. They do take more time, attention, and effort to put events in some kind of context. And they've become, that is, more interpretive than they once were. And that's especially in the US case, and I think not very different from the European case from the 1970s or so on. But what that what's the word I'm looking for? The almost physical reality. It's not a physical reality, but the substance of events is what journalists are dealing with. And when they wake up in the morning, they don't know what it's going to be. Suddenly, an airplane crashes into the World Trade Center towers. No one was expecting that day, well, except a few conspirators, but the rest of the world was stunned. And whatever else was on the reporters or the editors or the publisher's agenda that morning immediately changed. Now that's a particularly dramatic and world-shattering example, but there's examples like that all the time of a smaller sort. But I mean, lots of people use the news still to find out how they should dress in the morning, because we don't know. I mean, the meteorologists have a pretty good idea, and that's where you go. You go in the US, you go to the National Weather Service, or one of the National Weather Service provides the news for about weather for the local television weather person, and that's where you get the information. But it's not fully predictable. We were supposed to have snow this week. We didn't. We were supposed to have some snow a month ago. We got a foot of snow. I mean, you don't know these things, and they vary a lot. And sometimes they become big events. They become a flood. They become something that all but unseats a president if he doesn't call out the National Guard soon enough to deal with it. So those coronavirus at the moment, this was not something that was on people's agenda. And suddenly it became the event of our moment. So an event is usually something with a beginning and a middle and an end. It's a car crash. It's a robbery. It's a murder. A pandemic, well, it has a beginning. We don't even know if we're in the middle. We're certainly not at the end. And some events are like that, but they acquire a name, they acquire some images, they acquire a way of talking about them, and normally that is created, codified by journalism and journalists.
You're almost, but not quite, saying that events themselves have a structure that in some ways conforms to a kind of narrative.
Yes, I mean, there are kinds of narratives that are kind of natural out there. I mean, yes, we tell stories, we make stories, but those stories themselves are kind of organized by things in the physical world. The sun rises, the sun sets, beginning and end of a day. That's a narrative. You might want to put in a character or two besides. I mean, whose day was it? Brendan's or Michael's or somebody else's? And maybe there's some interesting conflict about it. Some kind of drama you want to introduce as well. But there is, there is a kind of drama to the rising and setting of the sun.
That's a beautiful allusion. And you've also alluded to the, let's say, the contemporary predicament in what you've just said, which makes me want to ask a little bit more about the contemporary predicament, and specifically, so is there a crisis of information? And if there is, what are the risks? And is there anything we can do about it?
There was a television show, this is showing my age, but called the $64,000 question. And that's how much money you earned if you won on this TV contest. So yeah, that's what we used to call the $64,000 question. The internet and social media and the digital era in general have upset apple carts about information. We don't know. I certainly don't, but I think it's in general true. We don't know quite what to do with this. It provides remarkable virtues. I think particularly of individuals with rare diseases. There isn't anyone else in their personal acquaintance with the same disease. Well, maybe their doctor knows about someone else with the disease, but they live 1,000 miles away. How do you get in touch with them? Well, that's not so difficult anymore. People can connect with one another in ways that were much harder, if possible at all, before the internet. And that is, I think it's utterly remarkable and wonderful, because these people need social support, they need medical advice. Often they get medical advice from other people, not doctors, but people suffering from that same rare illness. Okay, that's one instance. There are many like that, but that one's often very dramatic. On the other hand, people lose track of where the information that they find online comes from. I find myself saying, oh, I just read, and talking to a friend or a colleague or to my wife, well, where did I read it? And I don't remember exactly. It seemed reliable at the time. It was worth passing on, but I didn't really check the footnotes, or even remember. I mean, I know if I read it in the printed newspaper. I also read newspapers online, but if I only get one printed newspaper a day, and that's the New York Times. So I know that I read it there. I don't necessarily remember if it was an AP story or a New York Times reporter. It's usually a New York Times reporter, but not always. And who was the reporter and what page was it on? I don't remember that, but at least I have it pretty well located. New York Times authenticated. But online, you have to be very canny and good online to be able to keep track of where the information comes from. And sometimes, as we know all too well now, it's completely bogus. It's either intentionally misinforming us, or it's someone passing on information that they took to be reliable, that they didn't check at all, and that is to others who know the subject area completely nuts. It just makes no sense. There is no evidence. It's wrong. It's wrong because it might be a fable, but it's wrong because it might be a lie, or it might be some combination with various conspiracy theories. And they travel more easily, more readily than ever before. Rumors in the past could also move very quickly. This is not the first time that that it's not that the digital era invented all of this. It just moved it more speedily, more widely, with more ready access for people all over the world.
I think maybe what we're talking about is control, the concept of control, and how this changes depending on what institutions are involved or what industries are involved. It's a fascinating answer and a fascinating topic that I think we'll return to.
Yes, and it's certainly, the promise, the hope that many internet pioneers had was that this is going to democratize information. And it has, to some significant extent, done that, but with mixed results. I mean, in this world, so the benefits of expertise are reduced. The availability of nonsense is much larger. And it moves in the same way that authoritative information moves. Is this a crisis? Yeah. If crisis means a point of tension, it's not quite a crisis of that sort. It's a simmering crisis, I guess, because it's going to be with us a long time as we figure out better how to deal with it.
Right. And attractive though the theme of the contemporary predicament is, may we just step back a little bit into the past for a couple moments. And I haven't said much about the Euronews project yet, but let me just explain a little bit about what we do, because it has to do with the next question. We analyze the production and spread of news in the early modern period in the form of handwritten newsletters. The pieces of news we study are kind of short. They report events with not too much commentary, but as you write in one of your chapters, even the first printed newspapers were more like newsletters than newspapers, and this was the case until about the 19th century. What historical, cultural, and social factors do you think led to the professionalization of journalism in the late 19th century? How did this all happen? This is a major thesis of a lot of your work, but I'm curious about where that question sits with you now, and what you think about why journalism as a genre, as a set of practices and textual forms and so on, emerged precisely in that period.
I don't think I have a complete handle on that. I wrote about the professionalization of journalism in my very first book, 1978, and some of the answer came after that for me. Some of the answer that's there in the book is that commercialization was an important factor in separating or allowing for a kind of independence of the news people, the reporters and editors and newspaper owners, from political parties, from state control, and newspapers began to be economic successes, and that allowed several things. One, it allowed them to hire a lot of reporters. Hiring a lot of reporters meant reporters began to, I mean, in some ways there's something quite quantitative about it, I think, that there were enough reporters. I mean, a reporter was a rare bird in the early 19th century. Reporters were beginning to be hired by newspapers, but there weren't a lot of them. By the 1870s, 80s, there were a lot of them, at least in urban areas, and newspapers could have staffs of 20 or 40 or 60 or 80 reporters. And they talked to one another, and they had drinks together, not just those at the one newspaper, but a big city would have a dozen newspapers. And there would be bars and pubs and taverns where they would hang out, and they developed a language. They developed even some professional organizations and professional journals where there was writing about this thing that we do called journalism. I guess I'm not sure exactly. You may know when the word journalism and journalist began to be widely used, but certainly they understood themselves as reporters with a job. It was in some cases becoming a community as well as a job. And at that point also, the newspapers and the reporters acquired some set of ambitions. They started in the U.S. case, and it's an interesting thing. I think that the U.S. kind of invented interviewing for that you would. This was not waiting for an event to happen. It was creating an event around someone who was an authorized knower, a celebrity, a cabinet officer, and so on. The mayor. That was a novel experience, to be interviewing someone, and a lot of the people who were to be interviewed didn't quite understand it and thought it was pretty cheeky of the reporter who was the reporter. Nobody. Whereas I'm a cabinet officer. I'm the mayor. Why are you asking me questions? It took a while for the politician, the celebrity who want to to realize there might be something in this for them. It might be to their advantage to be interviewed, written about, get their language and their words into the newspaper. So a set of tools began to develop, and that further made it apparent, I think, to the reporters that, oh, we do something that's distinctive. They started writing lead paragraphs. For much of the 19th century in American newspaper, the news items were reported chronologically. Not so by the 1890s. There was always, there began to be always a lead paragraph that indicated the reporter's judgment about what the most important aspect of the event reported on was. And then you could read chronologically or otherwise organize the rest of the story. But in not just the headlines were relatively new as well. But in the lead paragraph, the reporter said, I'm an authority here. This isn't my personal opinion. This is my opinion as a journalist, that the thing that you should pay attention to in what you're about to read is this. And here it is in the first paragraph, in the first sentence, very often. So that also was a kind of linguistic and generic invention of a particular kind, turning the news item into a particular kind of text, one in which I'm quoting a British scholar, Donald Matheson, talking about how the newspaper in the 19th century, for the most part, was a jumble of texts. So sometimes it was just the Treasury report printed, or the text as best as they could get it of a speech in the Parliament or in the Congress. And the reporter that, as such, didn't have much of a voice, as Matheson puts it. There were so many different voices for which they were the stage, but a journalist voice as such didn't emerge until about this point, the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. And so you get these reasonably economically successful and growing in size news organizations, newspapers. And at some point, I don't know where exactly, it turns, they say, oh, we're journalists. We're friends, we have a community. We are even getting our names sometimes in bylines in the paper. And we're doing an important service. Sometimes they thought that, sometimes they were just doing a job, but sometimes they thought of it as serving a cause of good government or a good society. It takes a while for that to fully develop. They do talk about science as something of a model, that they're gathering facts just like scientists do. Okay, they had a naive notion, I think, of science, but it was a kind of aspiration for them. So that's not a full answer to your question, but I think it does have to do with what some sociologists would call the differentiation in society, that journalism becoming a kind of separate domain of its own, and trying to establish some self-consciousness of its own.
You mentioned the community of journalists and the creation of a certain, well, we might say social solidarity among journalists, which leads to a sense of common interest and also of mission in a way. And what I'm wondering now is, what about the context in which this creation of the journalistic community is occurring, specifically the context of readership. So is there a point where one can connect this sociological development of the professionalization and so on to a reader response, what readers are saying, what readers are needing, that somehow is part of this movement that you've described so well?
Yes, or yes and no. I think the world of the journalist was somewhat insulated from its audience. They didn't do opinion polling. They didn't do market research in those 1880s to 1920s days. And certainly people were not sending them emails complaining about their last story. But there was what my colleague at New York University, Rodney Benson, talks about what he calls audience adjustment as one of the features that characterizes the contemporary news world. And I think there's audience adjustment that goes back to the 19th century, that, well, you heard from your friends. I mean, you heard a lot from other reporters. They read news more to this day. They read news much more closely than the rest of us do. And they see things in it, and they can probably guess who the source was. I can't begin to guess who the source was on the stories I read. But insiders, other journalists, tend to know or make good guesses. They made terrible guesses about Deep Throat. Most people were very surprised when he was revealed years after the story. So the audience now does play a role, and it's partly an economic concern. You don't want to displease your audience so that they stop subscribing, or that they stop watching, or paying attention, or go to some other source, not you as a news source, as a news organization. So you want to be in touch, and you want to keep abreast of what's going on with your audience, or your hoped for audience. So when news organizations, particularly after the 1960s, began to move away from politics and business as their main categories that they were reporting on, to leisure, to news you can use, consumer-oriented news, that was responding to things around them. There was a women's movement. My goodness, what's that? In the late 1960s, say. And, we don't have any women in the newsroom. Or, oh yeah, we have a couple, they're on the fashion page. But it was eye-opening for a lot of journalists, and it the changing society around them changed what they attended to, and because they're what good journalists are kind of weather vanes. They're sensing organisms that want to keep in touch with the world around them in general, but specifically those who pay attention to the news, or who might be paying attention to the news, if only they could find out what it was that was really on people's minds. So, you know, there are some ways of doing that formally now with market research, but I suspect that matters less to most reporters than the person who they meet at a party who says, "Oh, you're a reporter. Let me tell you a thing or two about what you should be writing." And my impression is reporters get that a lot, and probably have for some time if people were willing to speak to them at all.
In your chapter on objectivity 1.0 and objectivity 2.0 and beyond, you give journalism a marvelous role in contemporary society with, of course, the necessary caveats. And you say, like the doctor who must keep both science and patient in view, the reporter has an impossibly difficult task that can never be flawlessly completed. But when it is well executed, it can be eye-opening. It can hold power to account in ways that no other institution in society does with such public exposure, and thereby can be the source of great public good. And all this is normally undertaken not to achieve a specific political goal, but to serve the larger aims of a vocation that holds that the fair-minded pursuit of truth, even truths uncomfortable or inconvenient, is the greatest service journalism can offer to society. Okay, now this is a strikingly responsible role that you're describing here. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure.
And your endorsement of this role?
Well, yes. I mean, it's what, you know, I started talking to journalists when I was way back when in the 1970s. Well, I didn't do it at all, really, in my dissertation, where my first book came out of. That dissertation ended about 1940, because I had a question, which is, where did objectivity come from as a journalistic ideology? And by the time I got to through the 20s and 30s, I had an answer. And people can look at the book for the specifics of that answer. But then I was looking for a publisher, and they said, "Don't stop at 1940. You know, it's the 1970s. Tell us more. What happened after that?" And in doing that, in moving forward, I talked to journalists and asked them, because they were working in this business that I was writing about. And from that point on until, last week, the journalism faculty at Columbia Journalism School, and they're mostly journalists and former journalists, many of them still writing journalism, and a handful of pure academics in the group, like myself, we're trying to rewrite a 10-year-old mission statement for the journalism school. And you could see in the mission statement, which will be I expect, changed a bit here and there, but it's sense that this is this is sort of a sacred profession we're a part of, and it's sacred because we provide this public service, and the public service is based on some commitment not to pushing one or another line politically, but to a belief in democracy, a belief in the value of empirical inquiry. That I sometimes thought, just taking this from the atmosphere of the journalism school, which was, I think, the second journalism school in the US after Missouri. And because for various reasons, including its location in New York, it's probably the most famous journalism school. People haven't given up the notion of objectivity. They might call it by some other name, because objectivity has been so taken as almost ridiculously ambitious. No one is objective. But one of my colleagues said, well, what we teach in this school is to report against your own assumptions, which I thought was an interesting way of putting it. It's not that any individual is objective, that we don't have views, that we don't have preferences, and that we don't have maybe even strong political convictions, though not necessarily. But that we have to guard against them. We have to bracket them. And I think the critics of objectivity, since I still believe in this, I think, kind of sophisticated sense that there is such a thing, the critics of objectivity latch onto the fact that no individual can be objective. That's true of scientists too. That's true of your doctor. No one can dispense with their own subjectivity, but they can discipline it. And an example I've used is most of us in daily lives have occasions where we do that ourselves. We know it's possible. Can I stand in your shoes, Brendan? No, but can I imagine what that might be like? Yes, and so if I'm talking to a friend or a student, students come to me for advice. That's part of my job, is to offer advice to students. And at some time, I'm not sure how forward I want to be about giving advice, but I can sometimes say, as people do all the time, well, I don't know what you should do, but if I were in your shoes, and then try to offer the advice. If I were in your shoes, that's a kind of objectivity. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But it is it is something human beings know how to do. Some do it better than others. Some are very empathetic. Some can see things from the other person's point of view more easily than others. Some of us get lost in our own framework. But journalists work to get out of their own framework, to find the voices around them and let those voices speak. I may have lost the question there somewhere, but
on this last note, you're making me think that this role of speaking truth to power, in a way, you might say, is fundamental. But you also make me think that journalists and historians may have quite a lot in common.
Yes, I think that's true. I know historians are always warned not to be presentist, and to try to think themselves back into the era that they're talking about if they want to understand why people were doing what they were doing at that time. I think it's, yeah, I think it's not so different from the discipline that good journalists learn to develop.
And one thing that historians normally don't have to do is put themselves in harm's way. This makes me think of that provocative title of Chris Hedges's book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And he considers General Patton's famous phrase, compared to war, all other forms of human endeavor shrink to insignificance. God help me, I do love it so. Now, is war reporting a special genre requiring particular identifiable skills that perhaps need to be more honed for that kind of context than for others?
It's one that the most prominent among now quite a lot of reporting that does put the reporter in harm's way. Reporting on drug cartels in Mexico is around the Mexican-U.S. border. That puts reporters in harm's way. Sometimes covering a hurricane or a flood may put a reporter in harm's way, and reporting political demonstrations that may turn violent and sometimes do puts reporters. Besides, probably these purportedly neutral observers who they don't trust to be neutral at all. War reporting is special. It's not a topic I know a whole lot about, but for a long time, war reporters and foreign correspondents in general have had more license to be interpretive in their reporting. Well before the interpretive reporting and then that became kind of legitimated and standard in the 1970s, 1980s, and after to this day in the US. Foreign correspondents were allowed to, I guess encouraged to, explain things to us. Americans are not well known for being especially knowledgeable about any country outside the United States, including neighbors Canada and Mexico. So it became incumbent on US foreign correspondents to give more of a framework, more of a context, and opinion could enter in. And I think war reporters, since most war reporting has been about wars in which the US was not involved, although we tend to be involved in a lot of wars, but that gave a kind of special position to the war reporter. A name could be known. Sometimes a first person could be part of the story, including even broadcast journalism. Edward R. Murrow during the London Blitz, and identified himself and spoke in the first person about what he was seeing around him. I'm thinking of there are other famous examples, but yes, that's I don't know what that takes. I'm in awe of some of the war reporting I've read or read about. You know, some people have more of a zest for danger and for adventure than others. I'm not one of them, but you know, I started out graduate school not in sociology but in anthropology, and I was surprised that some of my fellow students really didn't like to read and write that much. What they wanted was adventure. They wanted to go to some completely unstudied place, far away, where they would have to, you know, learn to build their own hut or whatever it was, and or they could ride horses because that's how you got from one place to another. The war reporter, I suspect, some, not all, I mean, everything is more complicated than that, but I think the war reporters are often drawn to a sense of danger, a sense of adventure. I did have a close friend, still a close friend, who spent some months in Vietnam as a reporter. Did not become a reporter, but had this short hitch in reporting. And I remember returning, this is the early 70s, from Vietnam, and she said something very close to General Patton, that the excitement was kind of overwhelmingly attractive. The excitement, the danger, the intensity, something about life being so intense. That I've never forgotten this.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Your experience. And that is about Dan Bell, who alas died in 2011. And he's known for things like the end of ideology, the rise of post-industrialism, and so forth. Would you like to say a couple words on how his ideas have influenced your work?
Sure. In some ways, they're even more of an influence on me now than they were then. Then, 1970s, I was drawn to him as a possible advisor because I think because he knew something about everything, and he was not afraid to say what he thought about it. And I mean, part of what I wanted to write about was journalism, and he'd been a journalist. He didn't actually go to graduate school to get a PhD. He was awarded a PhD for already published articles in Fortune magazine. He was their labor reporter. his schooling was in um, left-wing socialist politics growing up in New York City. And so in some ways he was very much self-educated. He was teaching at Columbia before he came to Harvard, teaching in their general education program, and then writing a quite marvelous book about the general education program at Columbia University, which I didn't read till much later, and saw in it seeds of some of his later books, on like the book on post-industrial society. So it was his breadth rather than any particular idea. I did take a couple of classes with him, but one class in which he introduced me to John Dooley, I had never read. Raymond Williams, Culture and Society, I had never read. These were eye-opening works, Williams and Raymond Williams in particular. He had broad knowledge that, but in a way, what I'm most grateful to in retrospect is he was sort of, he's fierce, combative, defensive, all these things in his public persona. But with me, and I think with other doctoral students, he was avuncular. He was full of, bits of advice. I don't know how many times he said, you know Yiddish? And I grew up Jewish, but I know a handful of Yiddish words. No, he said, well, I'll translate. And then he would tell me some Yiddish story and in English. And I was, relatively timid as a graduate student. And I didn't know, how do you write a dissertation? So I would write outline. I would write an outline of what I think I wanted this dissertation to cover. And I would hand it in to him. And I did that, I think, 3 times. I gave him a second one. He read the second one and made his comments. Then I handed in the third one, and I handed it to him, and he glanced at it and threw it on the desk. He said, Mr. Schudson, you're getting very good at writing outlines, but why don't you just write a dissertation? And that was what I needed. Oh, you mean I'm ready? Yeah, just do the damn thing. I mean, that was a great moment in my education. Just don't ask me, don't outline, write it.
That's a great story. And thank you so much, Professor Michael Schudson, for your time with us today. And goodbye to everyone.